The alarms were screaming before I even opened my eyes. Red light filled the cockpit, and the whole ship shook like it was being torn apart by something enormous. I grabbed the controls and tried to level out, but the console in front of me was already sparking. Smoke curled up from a broken panel near my knees. I could hear Oliver shouting from the back of the ship, something about the engine, something about losing power, but his voice kept breaking apart under the noise. We were falling. Not flying. Falling. I had made this same cargo run a dozen times, hauling supplies between outposts near the edge of known space, far past any border where a human ship was expected or welcome. This time, something in the storm above the planet had reached up and grabbed us, some kind of energy field none of our scanners understood, and now the ship was a burning rock heading straight for the surface. I did the only thing I could do. I pointed the nose toward what looked like flat ground, gripped the controls until my knuckles turned white, and prayed. The impact threw me forward against the straps hard enough to knock the air out of my chest. Metal screamed. Glass shattered somewhere behind me. And then, everything went still. For a moment I thought I was dead. Then I heard Oliver coughing, and I knew we were both still breathing, which felt like a small miracle. I do not remember much after that. I remember unbuckling my harness with shaking hands. I remember pulling Oliver out through a gap in the hull because the door would not open. I remember the sky above us, a strange shade of violet, with 2 moons hanging low over hills covered in silver grass. And then I remember nothing at all, because the pain and the smoke and the shock finally caught up to me, and the world went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on a soft mat inside a round wooden building. Sunlight came through a woven roof above me, casting patterns on the walls. My chest ached, and there was a bandage wrapped tightly around my ribs. For a second, I panicked, thinking I had been captured by something hostile. I tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed against my shoulder. "You should not move yet," a voice said. "Your body is still healing." I turned my head and saw her for the first time. She did not look like anything I expected an alien to look like. Not the monsters from old stories. Not the twisted shapes some traders described when they came back from dangerous trade routes. She looked almost like a woman from home, except for her eyes, which held a faint golden shimmer, and her skin, which seemed to catch the light in a way human skin never did. Her hair was a deep shade of blue, braided simply, and she wore plain clothing, nothing fancy, nothing that suggested importance. "Where am I?" I asked. My voice came out rough. "You crashed near our village," she said. "My name is Elira. Your friend is resting in the next room. He will be fine. You were hurt worse than him." I tried to process everything at once. A crash, a village, aliens who spoke my language, or something close enough that I understood every word, which told me they must have translation devices built into something they wore, though I could not see anything obvious. "Thank you," I said, "for helping us." She tilted her head slightly, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle they find interesting rather than frightening. "Many people in this village wanted to leave you both outside the walls. They said humans bring nothing but trouble wherever they land." "That's a popular opinion where I come from too," I said, trying to force a small laugh even though my ribs protested. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or amusement. "You joke. Even now, it's either that or cry," I said. "Jokes hurt less." She studied me a moment longer, then reached for a cup of water sitting nearby and helped me drink. Her hands were steady, careful, like she had done this many times before, though something about the way she moved told me she was not used to doing this kind of work herself. Her fingers were soft, unused to labor. Over the next few days, she came to check on me often. I learned her village sat near the border of a much larger kingdom, a place she called Vantara, ruled by a king whose land stretched across half the visible sky. She never explained why a healer's daughter, which was what she claimed to be at the time, seemed to know so much about diplomacy, politics, and the movement of ships across star systems most villagers would never see in their lives. I did not question it much, not at first. I was too busy trying to survive, too busy learning how to move without pain, too busy watching Oliver slowly get better in the room beside mine. The villagers were not cruel, but they were careful. They watched me the way people watch something they do not trust yet. Children peeked through doorways and ran when I looked their way. Elders spoke quietly among themselves whenever I passed, their eyes following me like I might do something dangerous at any moment. They believe humans do not know when to stop, Alira told me one evening, as we sat outside watching the twin moons rise. They say your people fight even when the fight is already lost, that you refuse to accept defeat even when defeat is certain. Is that supposed to be an insult? I asked. She looked at me carefully. I have not decided yet. I laughed, and this time it did not hurt as much. Where I come from, that's usually called stubbornness. Sometimes it gets people killed. Sometimes it gets people out of situations they should not have survived. Which was it for you? She asked. When your ship was falling. I thought about it honestly before answering. I do not know. I just knew I was not going to stop trying until we hit the ground. After that, it was out of my hands. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the moons. Most people I know would have given up the moment the situation became hopeless. They believe there is no point fighting against something certain. Maybe that's the difference, I said. We don't know the difference between hopeless and difficult until it's already over. She smiled at that, a small, private smile, like I had told her something she wanted to remember. I did not think much of it at the time. I was just grateful to be alive, grateful for a warm place to heal, grateful that this strange woman with golden eyes had decided, for whatever reason, that I was worth saving. It was almost 2 weeks later when everything changed. I was walking near the edge of the village, testing my strength, when I heard the sound of engines in the sky, low and heavy, nothing like the wind-powered gliders the villagers use to travel between settlements. I looked up and saw 3 sleek ships descending toward an open field just outside the village walls, their hulls gleaming with a kind of polished elegance that immediately told me they belonged to someone important. Villagers began gathering, bowing low as the ships landed. Guards stepped out first, tall figures in armor that shimmered faintly, followed by attendants dressed in fine fabric unlike anything I had seen since arriving. Then Alira stepped out of the house where I had been staying, and something about her had changed. She was not wearing the plain clothing I had grown used to. Instead, she wore a long, flowing garment, woven with threads that seemed to catch every color of the setting sun, and a thin circlet rested across her brow. The guards bowed to her. The villagers bowed lower. I stood there, frozen, finally understanding what I had somehow missed for 2 weeks. She was not a healer's daughter. She turned to look at me, and there was something almost apologetic in her expression, though pride sat there too, quiet and certain. I should have told you sooner, she said, walking toward me while the entire village watched. My name is Alira Vantessa. I am the daughter of King Doran, ruler of Vantara. I did not know what to say. 2 weeks of quiet conversations, shared meals, careful hands helping me heal, and the entire time I had been talking to royalty without the faintest idea. You could have mentioned that, I said, once I found my voice again. Would it have changed how you spoke to me? She asked. I thought about that honestly. Probably. I would have been more careful, less myself. Something in her expression softened, like that was exactly the answer she had been hoping for. That is why I did not tell you, she said. I wanted to know what a human was like, when a human did not know he was speaking to someone who could have him executed for the wrong word. I raised an eyebrow. And? What's the verdict? She studied me for a long moment, the guards waiting patiently behind her, the villagers still bowed low around us, the twin moons rising slowly overhead. The verdict, she said quietly, is that I am not ready to say goodbye to you yet. Before I could respond, one of the guards stepped forward and announced, in a formal tone that carried across the entire field, that Princess Alira Vantessa and her guests would be returning to the capital immediately, by order of the king. I looked at Oliver, who had limped outside just in time to catch the tail end of the announcement, his eyebrows raised so high they nearly vanished into his hairline. Guests, he muttered under his breath. I think that means us. I did not know, standing in that field with the wind pulling at my torn clothing and the weight of an entire kingdom's attention suddenly falling on me, that this was only the beginning. I did not know about the court waiting ahead of us, filled with nobles who already hated everything I represented before they had even met me. I did not know about the suitors, the politics, the danger that would follow. All I knew, in that moment, was that the woman standing in front of me, dressed in royal colors with golden eyes catching the last light of the setting sun, was smiling at me the way she had smiled at me every day since I woke up in her care. Softly, honestly, like she meant it. And somewhere behind that smile, I could tell, a much larger storm was only just beginning to gather. The capital of Vantara rose out of the hills like something carved from crystal and gold. As our ship descended toward the palace grounds, I pressed my hand against the window, staring at towers that curved upward in impossible shapes, bridges made of light stretching between buildings, and gardens that seemed to glow faintly even in daylight. Oliver sat beside me, equally speechless, though he kept muttering about how none of our trade reports had ever mentioned anything like this. They do not let outsiders see this place often, Alira said, watching us both with quiet amusement. You should feel honored. Honored is one word for it, Oliver said. Terrified is another. She laughed, a light sound that seemed almost out of place in the formal chamber of the ship, surrounded by guards who stood so still they barely seemed to breathe. The moment we landed, I understood exactly what Oliver meant. The palace courtyard was filled with nobles, all dressed in fine layered robes, all watching our small landing party, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. Whispers moved through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. I caught fragments of words in their language, words I was only beginning to understand, but the tone needed no translation at all. Outsiders, savages, the dangerous ones. A tall man stepped forward from the crowd, his robes trimmed with silver thread, his expression carved from stone. He barely glanced at me before addressing Alira directly. "Princess," he said, bowing just enough to satisfy formality without conveying any real respect. "The court is surprised by your choice of company." "Lord Kalen," Alira said, her voice even, "these are the survivors of the ship that crashed near the border village. I am certain my father will want to hear their account personally." Kalen's eyes flicked toward me, cold and measuring, like he was calculating exactly how much of a threat I represented, and concluding the answer was very little. "Humans," he said, as if testing the word. "I have heard many stories about your kind, none of them flattering." "Then you should be pleased to know most stories are usually wrong," I said, before I could stop myself. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the gathered nobles. Kalen's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Careful, human," he said quietly. "Words carry weight here that they may not carry wherever you come from." "Where I come from," I said, "words carry plenty of weight too. I just try to make sure mine are honest." Alira stepped between us smoothly, though I noticed the corner of her mouth twitch upward before she composed herself. "My father is waiting," she said. "We should not delay." The throne room was even more overwhelming than the courtyard, a massive hall with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow, lit by floating lights that drifted lazily overhead like slow, glowing fireflies. King Doran sat upon a raised platform at the far end, an older man with the same golden shimmer in his eyes that Alira had, though his expression carried none of her warmth. He listened as Alira explained our crash, our rescue, and our presence in his court. His gaze remained fixed on me the entire time, sharp and evaluating, the way a merchant studies goods he is not yet sure he wants to buy. "You survived a fall that should have killed you both," he said finally, his voice deep and measured. "Tell me, human, why did you not simply abandon the ship the moment you understood it was falling?" I thought carefully before answering, aware that every noble in the room was listening. "Because giving up felt worse than dying," I said. "If I was going to go down, I wanted to go down still trying to fix it. The king studied me in silence for a long moment. Somewhere behind me I heard Kalen make a small, dismissive sound. An interesting philosophy, the king said eventually. Reckless, perhaps, but interesting. He turned to Alira. They will remain here as guests of the crown until proper arrangements can be made for their return journey. It was meant, I think, as a temporary courtesy. None of us knew yet how long that arrangement would stretch. Over the following weeks, I began learning the rhythms of court life, and it quickly became clear that everything I did was being watched, judged, and discussed behind closed doors. The nobles treated me like a curious animal that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. Servants whispered when they thought I could not hear. Even simple meals became complicated events, filled with rules I did not understand until I had already broken them. During one formal dinner, I reached for a piece of bread using my left hand, unaware that the gesture was considered deeply disrespectful, reserved only for addressing prisoners or servants being dismissed from service. The entire table went silent. Kalen, seated several places down, smiled thinly, clearly pleased to witness my mistake. "It seems humans are not familiar with basic courtesy," he said loudly enough for the whole table to hear. I felt heat rise in my face, embarrassed but unwilling to show it. "Where I come from, using the wrong hand at dinner isn't usually a crime," I said, "but I'm happy to learn the right way to do things here, if someone bothers to explain the rules before I break them." A young noblewoman named Sela, one of Alira's closest companions, hid a smile behind her cup. "He has a point," she said quietly. "We never explained the custom to him." Alira, seated beside her father, caught my eye across the table. There was something warm in her expression, something that told me she was not embarrassed by my mistake, only entertained by how honestly I handled it. Not every moment was so light-hearted. A few days later, during a training exercise meant to demonstrate the skills of visiting foreign guests, one of Kalen's men deliberately provoked me in front of a crowd, mocking human strength and stamina, claiming our bodies were fragile compared to their own. I refused to rise to the bait at first, but when he pushed further, insulting not just me but the memory of my crashed crew, something in me refused to stay silent. "You want to test human stamina," I said. "Fine, name the exercise." What followed was not a fight, not violence, simply a demonstration of endurance, carrying weighted stones across the training yard, repeated over and over under the hot afternoon sun. His people were stronger in short bursts, faster in quick movements, but as the exercise dragged on, exhaustion crept into his steps while I kept moving, slower perhaps, but steady, refusing to stop even as my arms burned and my legs shook. By the end, he had given up twice, resting while I continued. The gathered crowd, mostly servants and lower nobles who had come to watch out of curiosity, began murmuring with something that sounded almost like respect. Kalen, watching from the shadows of a nearby archway, said nothing, but his expression had lost some of its earlier confidence. That evening, Alira found me sitting alone near the palace gardens, my arms still sore, watching the twin moons rise over the crystal towers. "You did not need to prove anything today," she said, sitting beside me. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But people kept saying humans give up easily. I wanted them to see that isn't true." She was quiet for a moment, studying the way the moonlight caught the edges of the garden. "My people value strength," she said eventually, "but we value it differently than you do. We value strength that wins quickly, efficiently, without struggle. You value strength that simply refuses to stop, no matter how difficult the struggle becomes." "Which do you think is better?" I asked. She turned to look at me directly, her golden eyes steady. "I used to believe our way was superior," she said. "Now, I am no longer certain." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, simply sat beside her in comfortable silence while the twin moons climbed higher into the sky. "They will keep testing you," she said eventually. "Kalen especially. He does not simply dislike you. He fears what you represent." "What do I represent?" I asked. "Change," she said simply. My father has been quietly building alliances with human territories for years, hoping to strengthen Vantara's position against rival kingdoms. Kalen's house has opposed this alliance from the beginning. Your presence here, surviving, adapting, even thriving in ways none of us expected, makes it much harder for him to argue that humans are beneath consideration. So I'm a political problem, I said. You are a political opportunity, she corrected, depending entirely on how this unfolds. I studied her carefully. And which one am I to you? She smiled, that same soft, private smile I had seen so many times since waking up in her care weeks ago. Neither, she said quietly. To me, you are simply someone who does not perform respect, he does not feel, and does not pretend to be something he is not. That is rare here. Rarer than you understand. I felt something shift in my chest, warm and unfamiliar, though I was not ready yet to put a name to it. Careful, princess, I said lightly, trying to ease the sudden weight of the moment. People might start talking. People are already talking, she said, standing and smoothing her robes. I have decided I do not mind. She left me there among the glowing gardens, moonlight spilling across silver grass, and for the first time since the crash, I allowed myself to wonder whether surviving this world might mean more than simply staying alive. It might mean building something entirely new. But somewhere in the shadowed halls of that same palace, Kalen was already planning his next move, certain that whatever growing bond existed between the princess and the human guest needed to be broken before it grew into something neither he nor his allies could control. The announcement came almost a month later, delivered by a royal steward in the middle of a crowded morning gathering. King Doran had decided it was time to formally consider suitors for Princess Alara, and 3 noble houses had already submitted their candidates for consideration. Lord Kalen's house was among them, and Kalen himself intended to present his own claim personally. I remember standing near the back of the hall when the announcement was made, watching Alira's face carefully. She showed no surprise, only a tired kind of resignation, like this was a conversation she had been dreading for a long time. Later that day, she found me near the training yard, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You knew this was coming, I said. I have known since I was a child, she said. Every princess in Vantara eventually faces this. I simply hoped I would have more time before it began. And Kalen? I asked. He actually thinks he has a chance. He believes strengthening his house through marriage to the crown would secure his position for generations, she said. My father has not yet refused his claim outright, mostly because rejecting Kalen without proper cause would create political tension we cannot currently afford. So what happens now? Now, she said, the suitors will each present a formal challenge, a trial meant to demonstrate their worth. It is tradition. My father cannot avoid holding it, even if he privately hopes none of them succeed. I studied her carefully, and if Kalen wins this trial... She did not answer right away, which told me everything I needed to know. The trial was scheduled for the following week, held in the great outdoor arena behind the palace, a massive stone structure surrounded by tiered seating that could hold every noble family in the kingdom. Word spread quickly that the human guest had been the subject of gossip regarding the princess, and Kalen, sensing an opportunity to remove an inconvenient variable, quietly arranged something far more dangerous than simple gossip. 2 days before the trial, a royal guard was found near the palace treasury, unconscious, with valuable ceremonial items missing from a locked chamber. Under questioning, the guard claimed he remembered seeing a human figure near the chamber shortly before losing consciousness. I was arrested within the hour. I remember sitting in a small holding chamber, guards posted outside, trying to piece together how any of this made sense. I had been nowhere near the treasury. I had spent that entire evening with Oliver, going over old trade route maps out of habit, something any of the palace staff could confirm if anyone bothered to ask them. Illyra arrived within the hour, furious in a way I had never seen from her before. "This is fabricated," she said to the guards outside my chamber. "Release him immediately." "Princess, one guard said carefully. The evidence was presented formally. We cannot simply ignore a witness statement. Then bring the witness before me, she said. I will question him myself. The witness, when finally brought forward, could not maintain his story under careful questioning. His account grew increasingly inconsistent, details shifting each time Alira pressed him, until finally he admitted, reluctantly, that he had been offered payment to identify a human figure near the treasury, regardless of whether he actually witnessed anyone at all. He would not name who paid him, too frightened to speak against a noble house, but everyone in that room understood exactly who benefited most from my sudden arrest. I was released, though the damage had already spread through court gossip. Kalen, publicly, expressed relief that the misunderstanding had been resolved, while privately ensuring rumors continued circulating that the human guest could not be trusted, that his presence invited chaos and suspicion wherever he went. He wanted you removed before the trial, Alira said, once we were alone in the garden that evening. Since that failed, he will try something else. Like what? I asked. I do not know, she admitted, but Kalen does not accept defeat easily. Be careful. 3 days later, the trial began. The arena was filled beyond capacity, every seat occupied by nobles eager to witness the spectacle. King Doran sat upon an elevated platform overlooking the field, Alira seated beside him, her expression carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from her posture. The trial, as explained by the royal steward, would consist of 3 challenges designed to test a suitor's intelligence, endurance, and honor. Each challenge would be judged by a panel of elder nobles, with the king holding final authority over the results. I had not been invited to compete, obviously. I was not a suitor. I was simply the human guest, seated near the edge of the arena among lesser dignitaries, watching Kalen prepare himself with the confident ease of someone who had trained his entire life for exactly this moment. The first challenge involved solving a complex puzzle constructed from interlocking crystal pieces, each requiring precise logical reasoning to arrange correctly. Kalen solved his with practiced efficiency, clearly having studied similar puzzles before. The second challenge tested physical endurance, climbing a smooth vertical structure using minimal equipment. Kalen completed this challenge as well, though it clearly cost him more effort than the first. The third challenge, however, changed everything. The final trial required each suitor to demonstrate honor by resolving a staged dispute between 2 actors playing feuding villagers, using only diplomacy, no violence permitted, judged entirely on wisdom and fairness of the resolution offered. Kalen approached the staged dispute with calculated precision, offering a resolution that favored whichever party held greater social standing, technically fair by the letter of tradition, but clearly designed to please the watching nobility rather than resolve the actual conflict presented. The elder judges seemed satisfied. King Doran, however, frowned slightly, clearly recognizing the hollow nature of the performance. Then, unexpectedly, Sayla stood from her seat near the royal platform. "Princess," she said, addressing Alira directly, though loud enough for the surrounding nobles to hear. "Might I suggest allowing the human guest to offer his own resolution to the same dispute, simply as a point of comparison? I am curious how differently an outsider might approach the same situation." Murmurs spread through the crowd immediately. This had never been done before, allowing someone outside the formal trial to participate, even informally. Kalen's expression darkened. King Doran considered the request for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well," he said. "Let us see how an outsider views our traditions." I stood, feeling every eye in the arena settle on me at once, and walked toward the staged dispute, my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. The 2 actors repeated their staged conflict, one representing a farmer whose crops had been damaged by a neighboring landowner's carelessness, the other representing the landowner refusing responsibility due to his higher social standing. Where Kalen had ruled based on standing and tradition, I approached it differently. "Where I come from," I said, addressing both actors directly rather than the watching nobles, "it does not matter who holds more status. What matters is who caused harm, and how that harm gets fixed. The farmer lost crops through no fault of his own. That needs repairing, regardless of anyone's rank. I proposed a resolution requiring the landowner to personally assist in repairing the farmer's damaged fields. Not simply pay a fine handled by servants, but perform the labor himself, publicly acknowledging responsibility rather than hiding behind social standing. The arena went completely silent. Then, slowly, applause began rippling through the lower seating areas, where common workers and lesser nobles sat, people who understood exactly what unfair advantage looked like, far better than the elite families seated closer to the royal platform. King Doran leaned forward slightly, studying me with an expression I could not quite read. "An unconventional resolution," he said finally, "but not without wisdom." Kalen stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. "This is absurd," he said. "The human was never a formal participant. His answer holds no bearing on this trial." "You are correct," King Doran said calmly. "It holds no formal bearing." He paused, glancing toward Illyra, whose expression had shifted into something unmistakably proud. "However, it has reminded this court that wisdom sometimes arrives from places we do not expect." The trial results were announced shortly after. Kalen technically won based on formal scoring, securing the highest marks across all 3 challenges. But something had shifted in the arena that day, something that could not be measured by any scoring system. The nobles who had once dismissed me as a curious oddity now watched me with something closer to genuine interest. Illyra found me later that evening, standing near the edge of the training yard, where everything had first begun weeks earlier. "You did not need to do that," she said. "Sela asked," I said. "Seemed rude to refuse a princess's friend." She smiled, shaking her head slightly. "You have made an enemy today," she said. "Kalen will not forget this." "I didn't exactly try to make friends with him before," I said. "Figured the damage was already done." She stepped closer, studying me carefully in the fading evening light. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "your answer was the only honest one given today." "High praise," I said, "coming from a princess surrounded by suitors offering hollow performances." "It is the highest praise I have," she said simply. We stood there together as the sun finally disappeared behind the crystal towers, neither of us speaking, both of us understanding that whatever quiet thing had been growing between us since that first night in the border village had just become impossible to ignore any longer. Somewhere across the palace grounds, Kalen watched from a shadowed balcony, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger, already calculating how far he was willing to go to ensure the human guest never became more than a temporary inconvenience in his plans. The warning came in the middle of the night, 3 weeks after the trial, delivered by Oliver, shaking me awake with an urgency I had not seen in him since the crash. "Something is wrong," he said. "The border patrols near the eastern hills went silent an hour ago. Sayla just sent word through one of the kitchen staff. She thinks Kalen has moved against the crown." I sat up immediately, pulling on clothes while my mind raced through the implications. Kalen's house controlled much of the eastern territory, closest to the mountain passes where smaller, hostile kingdoms occasionally tested Vantara's borders. If he had turned those defenses inward instead of outward, the palace itself could be exposed within hours. We found Illyra already awake, standing in the war room with several senior guards, studying a projected map of the kingdom's defenses with an expression of controlled alarm. "Kalen has withdrawn his forces from the eastern passes," she said the moment she saw me. "Officially, he claims a training exercise required their relocation. Unofficially, this leaves the mountain border completely undefended, exactly when scouts report movement from the Threll clans beyond the ridge." "You think he's letting them through?" I said. "I think he intends to arrive with reinforcements at precisely the right moment," she said, appearing to save the kingdom from an invasion he quietly allowed to happen, positioning himself as the hero the court desperately needs, while discrediting my father's judgment for ever doubting his loyalty. "And where do I fit into that plan?" I asked. She met my eyes directly. You do not fit into his plan at all, which is exactly why he wants you removed before it unfolds. A human ally, proving useful in the coming crisis, would undermine every argument he intends to make afterward. Within hours, reports confirmed her fears. The Threll clans, small but fiercely aggressive raiders from beyond the northern ridge, had crossed the undefended pass and were moving swiftly toward the outlying villages, the very same villages where I had first been rescued weeks earlier. King Doran convened an emergency council, torn between recalling Kaelin's forces immediately, which would take precious hours they did not have, or sending whatever remaining palace guard could be spared to intercept the raiders before they reached populated settlements. We do not have enough trained soldiers positioned close enough to respond in time, one general admitted grimly. By the time reinforcements arrive, the villages will already be overrun. I stepped forward before I fully decided to speak. I might have an idea. Every eye in the room turned toward me, several nobles exchanging skeptical glances. The villages sit along the river valley, I said, pulling the projected map closer and studying the terrain carefully. I spent weeks recovering near there. I remember the layout. There's a narrow crossing point where the river narrows before widening near the settlements. If we can slow the raiders at that crossing, even briefly, it buys enough time for reinforcements to arrive. Slow them how? The general asked, clearly doubtful. We do not need soldiers for this, I said. We need the villagers themselves. Simple defenses, barriers built from available materials, positioned to funnel the raiders into the narrowest part of the crossing, where a small defending force could hold the position far longer than open ground would allow. The general frowned. Untrained villagers cannot be expected to hold against organized raiders. They don't need to fight them directly, I said. They just need to slow them down long enough. Buy time, not win the battle outright. Illyra stepped forward, studying the map with newfound focus. This could work, she said. The Threll clans rely heavily on speed and momentum. If we disrupt that momentum early, even temporarily, it changes the entire engagement. King Doran studied me carefully for a long moment. You would lead this effort personally, he asked. I know the terrain, I said, and those villagers took care of me when nobody else would. I'm not leaving them to face this alone. The king nodded slowly. Then go. Take whatever guards can be spared. Princess Illyra will coordinate reinforcement timing from here. I am not staying here, Illyra said immediately. Her father turned toward her sharply. Illyra. The villagers know me, she interrupted. They will listen to instructions faster coming from the crown directly, rather than through relayed messages. I am going. The argument that followed lasted only a few tense minutes before the king, recognizing the truth in her reasoning and understanding the urgency of time slipping away, finally relented. We departed within the hour, moving faster than any formal military procession would normally allow, small enough in numbers to travel quickly, but carrying enough equipment to construct emergency defenses along the narrow river crossing. The villagers, when we arrived, were already aware something was wrong, having received warning from fast riders sent ahead. Fear was evident on every face, but there was something else too, a quiet willingness to listen when Illyra and I began explaining the plan. We are not asking you to fight, I told the gathered villagers, standing near the crossing point, where I had once watched twin moons rise while recovering from my injuries. We are asking you to help us slow them down. Every barrier we build, every obstacle we place, buys time for real reinforcements to arrive. Grace, one of the villagers who had helped nurse me back to health during those early weeks, stepped forward without hesitation. Tell us what to do, she said. Over the following hours, working alongside villagers, who trusted me because of the weeks I had spent among them, we constructed barriers from felled trees, redirected sections of the river using packed stones to create shallow flooding across the widest approach, and positioned makeshift alarms using strung bells that would sound the moment raiders crossed into the narrowed valley. Oliver, still recovering fully from his own injuries, took charge of coordinating messengers between our position and the approaching reinforcements, ensuring timing remained as precise as possible. Alira worked alongside the villagers personally, something I suspected surprised them as much as it surprised the accompanying palace guards, seeing their princess covered in mud, hauling stones alongside common farmers without complaint or hesitation. "They expected you to stay behind the lines," I said to her at one point, watching her direct a group of villagers repositioning a section of barrier. "I expected that too, once," she admitted. "But watching you these past months, I have come to believe leadership means standing beside people during difficulty, not simply directing them from somewhere safe." The Threll raiders arrived just before dawn, their approach heralded by the distant sound of horns echoing across the valley. The makeshift alarm bells rang out moments later as the leading raiders crossed into the narrowed crossing point, immediately finding their pace disrupted by the shallow flooding and packed barriers we had spent the night constructing. What followed was tense, chaotic, and far more frightening than I wanted to admit, even now. The raiders, confused by the sudden obstacles, bunched together at the crossing point exactly as we had hoped, their momentum broken, their formation disorganized. Villagers stationed at safe distances used simple signal horns to coordinate confusion among the raiders, directing them repeatedly toward dead ends and false paths through the barriers, buying precious additional minutes. By the time actual reinforcements arrived, thundering down from the hills in organized formation, the raiders found themselves trapped between disorganized confusion ahead and disciplined soldiers closing in from behind. Recognizing the hopelessness of their position, the Threll clans quickly retreated back toward the mountain passes. Their invasion collapsed before it ever truly began. The villages remained safe. Not a single person had been seriously harmed. And as the sun rose fully over the valley, casting golden light across the muddy barriers we had built through the night, I found Alira standing beside me, exhaustion evident on her face, mixed with something like quiet triumph. "You saved them," she said. "We saved them," I corrected. "All of us, together." Word of what happened spread quickly back to the capital, arriving well before we did. By the time we returned to the palace, exhausted but victorious, the story had already transformed into something larger than the simple defensive action it had actually been. A human guest organizing villagers to hold an undefended border until royal reinforcements arrived, working alongside the princess herself rather than remaining safely behind palace walls. Kaelin's carefully constructed plan, meant to position himself as the kingdom's savior, collapsed entirely under the weight of what had actually occurred. His forces, recalled hastily once news of the invasion spread, arrived well after the crisis had already been resolved, making his earlier withdrawal from the eastern passes appear exactly as suspicious as it truly was. King Doran, upon our return, summoned Kaelin before the full court, demanding explanation for the timing of his troop movements. Kaelin offered excuses that satisfied no one, his composure finally breaking under mounting scrutiny from nobles who had begun quietly questioning his judgment even before this incident occurred. "You withdrew defenses from our most vulnerable border," the king said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger, "at precisely the moment hostile forces chose to cross it. Explain to me why I should not consider this treason." Kaelin had no adequate answer. His house, disgraced by the scandal, quickly lost standing among the other noble families, several of whom withdrew their support entirely once the true sequence of events became impossible to deny. I did not witness Kaelin's final fate personally, occupied instead with recovering from the exhaustion of the previous days, but Sayla later told me that his political influence within the court had been effectively ended, his ambitions toward the throne now nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among younger nobles. That evening, standing once again in the same garden where so much had already unfolded between us, Alira turned to face me directly, her golden eyes reflecting the soft light of the twin moons overhead. "My father wishes to speak with both of us tomorrow," she said, "regarding what comes next." "That sounds ominous," I said. "It is not," she said, smiling gently. I believe, for the first time since you arrived here, we are finally free to decide our own path forward, without threats, without hidden schemes, without anyone standing in the way any longer. I studied her carefully, feeling the weight of everything we had survived together settle into something calmer, steadier, more certain than anything I had felt since the moment my ship first began falling toward this strange and beautiful world. Then let's go find out what that path looks like, I said. She reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine as naturally as if we had done this 1,000 times before, and together we walked back toward the palace, leaving the quiet garden behind, ready to face whatever waited for us next. The following morning, we stood together before King Doran in a private chamber far smaller and far less intimidating than the grand throne room where I had first faced him months earlier. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching the dust in the air like scattered gold, and for the first time since arriving in this kingdom, I did not feel like an outsider standing before judgment. I have spent many nights considering everything that has happened since you crashed near our border, the king said, studying me carefully. When you first arrived, I saw only a complication, an unpredictable variable in a court already balanced on careful alliances. I did not expect that complication to become the reason my daughter still stands here safely today. I only did what needed doing, I said. The villagers deserve just as much credit. Humility, the king said, almost amused. Another trait I did not expect from your kind, given the stories we have heard for generations. Stories tend to simplify things, I said. People are usually more complicated than the reputation that follows them. He nodded slowly, glancing briefly toward Illyra before returning his attention to me. My daughter has expressed her feelings toward you clearly, both through her words and through her actions these past months. I will not pretend the idea of a human joining this family does not carry significant political complications. Many in this court will resist the idea. Some already have. I understand that, I said. I'm not asking for this to be easy. I'm only asking for the chance to prove it's worth the difficulty. Something shifted in the king's expression, a subtle softening I had not seen from him before. That, he said quietly, is precisely the answer I hoped you would give. He rose from his seat, walking toward the window overlooking the palace gardens below, where servants were already preparing decorations for some upcoming celebration I did not yet understand the purpose of. Vantara has spent generations building careful alliances through calculated marriages, political arrangements designed to secure power rather than happiness, he said. I watched my own marriage follow that same tradition. It was respectful, functional, entirely without the warmth I see now between the two of you. He turned back to face us. I will not stand in the way of something rare simply because tradition suggests I should. Illyra stepped forward, taking my hand once again, this time in front of her father, without hesitation. Then you approve? She asked. I approve of my daughter's happiness, he said, which appears, against every expectation I once held, to be found standing beside a human who refused to give up on a falling ship, who refused to abandon frightened villagers, and who refused to compromise his honesty even when doing so would have made his life considerably easier. Word of the king's approval spread through the palace within hours, though not without resistance. Several noble families withdrew quietly from court gatherings, unwilling to openly support what they still considered an unacceptable arrangement. But far more surprising to me was how many others, particularly the younger nobles and common workers throughout the kingdom, expressed genuine support once the full story of the border crisis became widely known. Sayla became one of the loudest voices defending the arrangement publicly, often reminding skeptical nobles of exactly who had organized the villagers, while others hesitated, and exactly who had abandoned their post entirely during the same crisis. The following weeks passed in a strange blend of formal preparation and quiet personal moments. Illyra taught me more about Vantaran customs, this time without the fear of accidentally causing offense, since word had spread that the human guest was soon to become something considerably more permanent within the royal family. I taught her, in turn, about small human traditions, Simple things like sharing meals without formal ceremony, or spending quiet evenings doing nothing more meaningful than watching a sunset together without any political significance attached to the moment. Oliver, given the option to return home once a diplomatic vessel became available, chose instead to remain, establishing himself as an informal liaison between human traders and the Vanturan court, a role that would prove valuable as relations between our species slowly began shifting from suspicion toward genuine partnership. "Someone has to keep an eye on you," he joked when I asked why he chose to stay. "Besides, this place has grown on me, strange moons and all." The formal ceremony, when it finally arrived, took place not within the grand throne room, but within the same garden where Alira and I had shared so many quiet conversations since my earliest days recovering from the crash. She had insisted on this location personally, wanting our closest friends and family gathered somewhere meaningful rather than somewhere merely impressive. The morning of the ceremony, I stood nervously near the garden entrance, dressed in a blend of traditional Vantaran formal wear and small personal touches reflecting my own heritage, a compromise Alira had suggested herself, wanting both our worlds represented equally in this moment. Grace and several other villagers from the border settlement had traveled specifically for the occasion, standing proudly among nobles who, months earlier, would never have imagined sharing space with common farmers at a royal gathering. Sayla stood near the front alongside two other close friends of Alira's, a warm-hearted young woman named Ain and a quiet, thoughtful man named Ren, both of whom had grown genuinely fond of me over the preceding months, despite their initial caution. King Doran presided over the ceremony himself, his earlier reservations long since replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine pride. The ceremony itself followed traditional Vantaran customs, blended carefully with small human touches Alira had researched and requested specifically, wanting the moment to reflect both of our origins equally. When the formal portion concluded, and the gathered crowd began moving toward a smaller, more intimate reception within the garden itself, Alira pulled me gently by the hand toward the small circle of her closest friends, people who had known her long before I ever arrived, who had watched her grow from a curious young woman slipping away to border villages against her family's wishes, into someone confident enough to choose her own path regardless of tradition or expectation. She stopped in front of Sayla, Ain, and Ren, still holding my hand firmly, her expression soft and unguarded, in a way I had rarely seen her display so openly, even after everything we had already survived together. "This is my husband," she said simply. The words carried no grand announcement, no dramatic flourish, simply quiet certainty, spoken the same way someone might introduce a person they had known and loved their entire life, rather than someone whose arrival had once thrown the entire kingdom into uncertainty. Sayla's face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "About time," she said, laughing softly. "We were beginning to wonder if either of you would ever say it out loud." Anne stepped forward, studying me with the same curious warmth she had shown since our earliest awkward introductions months ago. "The kingdom owes you a great debt," she said, "though I suspect you would rather hear that from the villagers than from us." "I'd rather just be here," I said honestly, "wherever here happens to be." Ren, quieter than the others, simply extended his hand toward mine in a gesture I recognized now as a formal sign of respect among close friends, something Alira had taught me carefully during our months together. "Welcome to the family," he said simply. I looked around the garden, filled with people who had once regarded me with suspicion, fear, or open hostility, now gathered together, celebrating something none of them could have predicted the day my ship first crashed into this world. Villagers stood comfortably beside nobles. Human customs blended naturally alongside Vantaran traditions. The kingdom that had once viewed my species as unpredictable savages now stood ready to welcome an entirely new chapter in relations between our worlds, built not through calculated politics, but through simple, honest connection. Alira turned to look at me, her golden eyes catching the late afternoon light, the same soft smile I remembered from that very first day, waking up in her care within a small village home, unaware that the woman tending my injuries carried the weight of an entire kingdom behind her quiet, curious questions. "Regretting anything?" she asked quietly, just between the two of us. I thought about the crash, the suspicion, the trials, the danger, the long nights spent uncertain whether any of this would end in something worth the struggle. "Not for a single moment," I said. She smiled softly, the same expression that had first drawn me toward her all those months ago, back when I was simply a stranger, recovering in an unfamiliar bed, uncertain whether I would survive the night, let alone build an entirely new life on a world I had never expected to see. As the celebration continued around us, laughter mixing freely between human and Vantaran voices alike, I found myself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The crash that should have ended everything, the suspicion that could have kept me isolated and alone, the trials designed to break rather than build, the danger that threatened everything we had slowly constructed together. None of it had stopped what was clearly meant to happen. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, news of the marriage was already spreading across the kingdom, carried by messengers toward human trade outposts scattered along the border, toward rival kingdoms who would soon need to reconsider their assumptions about both species, toward a future neither Illyra nor I could fully predict, but one we were determined to face together, regardless of whatever challenges still waited ahead. For the first time since my ship first fell from the sky months earlier, I felt something I had almost forgotten was possible, a quiet, steady certainty that whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone. Illyra squeezed my hand gently, drawing my attention back toward her, away from the swirling thoughts of everything that had brought us to this moment. "Come," she said, smiling that same soft smile that had first told me, long before either of us said it aloud, exactly where this story was always destined to lead. "Our friends are waiting. Let us go celebrate properly." And so we did, walking together into the gathered crowd, leaving behind every doubt, every danger, every moment of uncertainty that had once threatened to keep us apart, ready instead to build something entirely new between two worlds that had never expected to find common ground, yet somehow, against every reasonable expectation, had found exactly that. The kingdom of Vantara would never look at humans the same way again, and I would never regret, for even a single moment, the crash that had once seemed like the worst day of my life, yet had somehow become the beginning of the best one.